Post-World War I Manhattan was a place of change. In the 1920s and early 1930s, both blacks and whites were breaking down previously strict racial barriers, hence Ann Douglas's nickname for the borough, Mongrel Manhattan. This racial integration was furthered by the growing popularity of jazz music. Evolved from African rhythms and slave folk songs, the new genre migrated from New Orleans to New York City. While privileged whites were intrigued and inspired by jazz and black culture, they had no reverence for the people and communities from which they sprang. The Cotton Club is one high-profile example of whites-only clubs which capitalized on black culture. Though most clubs were similarly inaccessible, the Savoy Ballroom was one of a kind in that it was affordable and inclusive. In the fall of 1935, Le Corbusier visited Manhattan and discovered the jazz culture. Intrigued by the Savoy Ballroom in terms of architecture as well as mood, he describes America's atmosphere as exuberant and when cathedrals were white. Le Corbusier compared black dancers and music to machines, claiming that they combat the chaos of modernity similarly through rhythm. To Le Corbusier, this was both fascinating and disturbing. His opinion of blackness was complex. Mabel Wilson states in Black Bodies, White Cities, "Crucial then to Le Corbusier's analysis of Manhattan is that this metaphoric blackness connotes a complex dialectical pair of both life and death." Manhattan, though compelling, represented the antithesis of Le Corbusier's argument for the radiant city, as he believed New York was too small and dirty, citing an abundance of both blackness and darkness as negative aspects of the city. While he believed he could make New York City white and pristine, he failed to prevent black culture from influencing European cities such as Paris, nor could he prevent the continued integration of blackness and black culture into the rest of the United States. Though some might defend Le Corbusier's interest in blackness because he found the Savoy Ballroom inspiring and appreciated Louis Armstrong's talent, their understanding of his value of blackness would be shallow. Le Corbusier did recognize blackness as having value, but he did so only in regard to its relationship to whiteness. To Le Corbusier, blackness was a foil for whiteness, framing its purity and acting as a catalyst. To fully understand and respect all inhabitants and all subcultures of a city, we must understand them as being independently valuable. Le Corbusier upheld the racist patriarchal systems of New York City by advocating for their use of black people and blackness as labor to sustain white scholarship and enlightenment. In Black Manhattan, James Weldon Johnson addresses the Harlemite stereotype of the exotic primitive, a misrepresentation which required concentrated effort to dispel. Many white authors liked the idea of a social enlightenment, but didn't want to change the way they functioned socially. They continued to uphold racial patriarchal standards and reinforced racist stereotypes. In An Architecture of Change, José Gómez and Susan Rogers argue that after the modernist era, when the highest demand of social and political architecture was present, the demand for change dropped drastically. Postmodern architects considered the utopian beliefs of modernists to be naive and unachievable, and instead focused architecture inwards, liberating it from politics. However, we are again in a period of rapid change, yet architecture is not nearly as politically charged as it was in the modern era. Architects only flirt with politics as not to alienate potential clients. Gómez and Rogers argue that we must find a balance between unification and diversity, that we must be able to separate utopian ideals and create a cultural melting pot, and allow architecture to be wholly inclusive. In her article, Critical Practice, Sarah Wigglesworth argues that practicing architecture critically calls for invoking change by acting from within the profession and forcing it to look from another perspective. For example, in her Stock Orchard Street project, she was asked to design a house that doubles as an office. In this project, Wigglesworth created a house that said more about the client's values than about idealism in life. The building she designed forces a confusion between working and domestic life, as she intended. She does this mainly to superimpose the notion that stereotypically the kitchen and domesticity are a woman's office, and in this project, she confuses the lines for both genders between working and living space. Lori Brown also offers ideas about change in feminist practices. She points out how few women make it to the field and how little visibility is spread among those who do. She argues that while exposure is not sufficient for change, it is a necessary first step to transform architectural practice and engagement. If we are to critically design, we must be fully aware of and invested in people from all walks of life in terms of clients, occupants, and architectural staff. The United States is not the only place where change is happening. In the Missoro Village project, change is instigated as the GA Collaborative works with a group of women who were widowed in the Rwandan genocide to create inexpensive, practical housing for those in need. Though the houses are primitive in comparison to much of modern Western architecture, the residences create a power for those women to break social barriers and gain some sort of their own independence in a protected atmosphere. As suggested in An Architecture of Change, it is clear that the Western world is once again in a period of change and social activism. While contemporary architecture has evolved since the 1920s, as has the social atmosphere of the United States, we still have a responsibility to design with a diverse public in mind and challenge existing power structures. We also have a responsibility to consider who is actually living in the cities we design, rather than who we think should be, which requires us, as architects, to recognize and fight our own biases and those within the architectural community. When designing buildings and planning cities, we should critically assess whether the hypothetical environment is responsible and inclusive, and consider the social repercussions that our architecture could bring about.